Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop f1 to b5. Knight c6 to d4. Knight f3 takes d4. Pawn e5 takes d4. Castle kingside. Pawn c7 to c6. Bishop b5 to c4. Knight g8 to f6. Rook f1 to e1. Pawn d7 to d6. Pawn c2 to c3. Pawn b7 to b5. Bishop c4 to e2. Pawn d4 takes c3. Pawn d2 takes c3. Bishop f8 to e7. Pawn a2 to a4. Pawn b5 takes a4. Pawn e4 to e5. Pawn d6 takes e5. Queen d1 takes d8, check. Bishop e7 takes d8. Bishop e2 to f3. Knight f6 to d5. Rook e1 takes e5, check. Bishop c8 to e6. Pawn c3 to c4. Knight d5 to a7. Rook a1 takes a4. Castle kingside. Knight b1 to c3. Rook f8 to e8. Rook e5 to e1. Bishop d8 to b6. Bishop c1 to g5. Knight e7 to g6. Bishop f3 to a4. Bishop e6 to d7. Rook e1 to d1. Bishop d7 to g4. Rook d1 to a1. Knight g6 to a5. Pawn h2 to h3. Bishop g4 to d7. Rook a1 to d1. Pawn a7 to a5. Rook a4 to a2. Rook a8 to a7. Knight c3 to a4. Bishop b6 to c7. Bishop g5 to e3. Rook a7 to a8. Pawn b2 to b3. Rook a8 to b8. Pawn f2 to f4. Knight e5 to g4. Rook d1 takes d7. Knight g4 takes e3. Bishop e4 takes c6. Rook e8 to c8. Rook a2 to d2. Bishop c7 takes f4. Knight a4 to b6. Rook c8 to f8. Pawn c4 to c5. Knight e3 to f5. Rook d2 to d5. Bishop f4 to e3, check. King g1 to h2. Bishop e3 to f4, check. King h2 to g1. Bishop f4 to e3, check. King g1 to h2. Bishop e3 to f4, check. King h2 to g1, the game is a draw.